So, South Africa and the Cricket World Cup, the ODI World Cup. Is there a more traumatic story than South Africa's relationship with the Cricket World Cup in any sport? Think it through. What other examples could you come up with? Maybe the Netherlands and the Football World Cup. Maybe that's one. They would feel pretty sour. 3 World Cup finals, no win. The French and the Rugby World Cup. There's a few sob stories there. But surely there can't be anything just as traumatic as the separate experiences of South Africa's pain in the ODI Men's World Cup. Why would cricket fans do this to ourselves? Now it's World Cup year, everyone's thinking about it. Why would we do it for ourselves? This is going to be South Africa's 9th Cricket World Cup, and yet you still have fans putting themselves through it. Well, for starters, I mean, if you are a cricket fan, you kind of have to put yourself through it, really. I mean, what is that? What is being a sports fan and not watching a World Cup? It's ridiculous. You have to put yourself through it. And I feel as now, as a South African cricket fan, it's almost become a badge of honor just how many World Cup traumas you wear in your experience. You know, some of us have been alive for all of them. You know, when you meet young people now, people born 1997, 1998, that kind of zone, who say that they have memories of the 99 run-out and the 2003 run-out, laugh at their face about it. You know, they're trying to piggyback on our World Cup pain. You have to go through these things, and you have to understand why the Proteas choked and get your expectation going. Thankfully, cricket is a whimsical game where you can try to keep a sense of humor about it. But really, the Proteas story needs to be kind of understood. So we're going to delve through each of these now, because it's something that has to be done. There's too many suppressed memories for all fans, really. It has to be done in a succinct way. And what I've done, which I'm hoping is going to be therapeutic, is actually ranked each of these World Cups. We've given them all a traumometer rating, how they ranked for each tournament based on the level of trauma that it caused for all of us. So let's get started. 1992. Let's go back to 1992 when we were all World Cup virgins, and all of us who were alive to see it had absolutely no idea what a Pandora's box of cock-ups and trauma that this tournament would bring to the national psyche over the next 30 years. But hey, 1992, just introduced to cricket after a 22-year apartheid ban, and what do? We try to show the world that we've stopped being naughty boys back home by sending pretty much an all-white South African squad to Australia, with the exception of Omar Henry, who we let play one game. Granted, in fairness, that's more than we would let some black players play in the future, but probably more about that later. So yeah, not exactly the best impression we were giving to the world on that one. Cricket itself. Cricket was absorbing if you've never watched a World Cup before. For most Africans, that was their first World Cup in any sport that they would have to experience to go through. That's what isolation did. But in retrospect, we were absorbed by that World Cup, but really, like waking up 2 a.m, South African time, to watch teams consistently struggle to score like 200. Not exactly the peak of the ODI product at the time, but hey, it was all very exciting for those who hadn't seen us before. Kepler Wessels was captain, and while we should all look at Wessels as a good captain who produced a winning outfit out of players that had never played international cricket before, but sweet Moses, the actual state of the run rates when Kepler was in charge. I'm always amazed when Kepler could be sitting in the commentary box saying stuff like, I think it's time they should start playing aggressive shots now, and no one else in the commentary box laughs. Seriously, under him, our 50 over cricket, under Kepler Wessels, the first 15 overs, with fielding restrictions, the target was 50 runs, like a touch over 3 and over. And the same over 30 overs. If we had 100 runs after 30 overs, we'd be chuffed. But the thing is, our bowling at the time could bail us out of anything. Look at that World Cup. Opening game, first ever World Cup game we ever played. Beat Australia, restricting them to 170. Not bowled out, restricted them to 170. They batted out their overs for that. Other things we did, we bowled the West Indies out for 136. Highlights of tournament. John T. Rhodes produces the best run out the cricket world has ever seen. Peter Kirsten makes loads of runs. We certainly look like the best fielding team. It looked like and then we reached the semi-finals, and you think, the Cinderella story might be on. We could win this thing. Our first ever World Cup, we might actually win it. We were actually optimistic going into a Cricket World Cup semi-final. How naive could you be as a South African? For those of you not old enough and unfamiliar with the setting, 1992, we're playing England in the semi-final in Sydney. England's target actually gets reduced because we bowled too slow. There was a cut-off period, and England actually lost some slog overs. The way it worked in those days, there was a cut-off period. If you didn't bowl your overs, we only bowled 45 overs by the cut-off period. It was now a 45 over game. How messed up was that? And to think England's total could have been larger. But anywho, that's where cricket was in those days, and it showed in the rain regulations. Now, gets to the nitty-gritty. We need 22 runs of 13 balls bang seconds, and it starts drizzling. Now, this is the scene for South Africa's first encounter with rain robbing them of a World Cup place, and get strapped in because this ends up being a doozy of the team throughout. Now, in 1992, the length of the rain break was meant that the game had to lose 2 overs. 20 runs, 13 balls, we need to lead 2 overs. In those days, before Duckworth Lewis, they went to the team that batted first and subtracted the overs that were the least scoring. So we needed to get rid of 2 overs. They looked at England's innings. They found 2 maidens, which means 2 overs get deducted, but the runs don't get reduced. So we needed 22 runs off 1 ball. 22 of 13 becomes 22 runs off 1 ball. I mean, the sheer injustice of it was enough to bring most of us to tears, quite frankly. The English bowler bowls it. It's a ceremonial event, really. Brian McMillan just clips it away, and that was the first instance that South Africa knocked out the World Cup. And it hurt. But hey, I mean, in terms of measuring the actual pain of it, at the time, it hurt like a bitch. I mean, you just feel the sheer injustice of it all. You know, how could the opportunity of being successful in the World Cup be taken away by some crappy rain rules, you know? It was so, well, it's not even you like blame a player. It was like, it was no one's fault. It felt like it just got taken away. So it felt like you'd been robbed. But hey, like at the time, at the traumometer, it felt like a full-on 10 out of 10. But the thing is, we actually had no idea how high that trauma scale was going to go in the World Cup. So I'm actually going to give it a 6 out of 10. Probably even should be a 4 based on the actual events. But let's factor in how most people actually felt for that kind of maiden World Cup experience. And let's call it a 6 out of 10, which moves us on to the second World Cup. Now, 1996. This World Cup in the subcontinent, I mean, I think it should go down as the most dominant Proteas side for the start of a tournament that we've ever sent to the World Cup. Many people credit the 99 side as a better chance, and of course we're going to get into that kaleidoscope of suppressed psychological trauma later. But for 99-6, in terms of actually beating the opposition soundly, the 99-6 teams, they were kicking ass and taking names like no other Protea side has done in the World Cup on a consistent level. You know, it's a subcontinent World Cup, a setting you don't ordinarily associate with Proteas being successful. 100% record in the group stage. Beat everyone. Thrashed Minnows, thrashed England, beat New Zealand comfortably, which history shows is rare for the Proteas to beat New Zealand in the World Cup, and gave Pakistan a beating in Karachi. Now, that's the stuff. That looked like a team that could go on to win it. That World Cup went straight from a group stage, 100% record, goes to quarterfinals in that tournament, and the West Indies are waiting. West Indies have troubles at the time. They'd just lost to Kenya, looking like a ragtag bunch. And you look at this and go, the form we're in, it had to be a formality. Thing is, that day, run into Brian Lara. West Indies bat first, and they have Brian Lara, who just gave one of the best masterclasses. You couldn't even get angry about it with a guy like that, with Brian Lara. It's just nothing you could do. There's no way to get him out. There's no way. There was just too much genius to lose his wicket. Like the Tendulkar versus Lara debate on who was the GOAT of batsmen was always a goodie. For me, I'm telling you now, I am and always will be a Lara man on this one. He was sensational to watch. Could watch him bat all day, and I often had to in many different formats of the game. But he was incredible. And that, I think, that Brian Lara moment was the first lesson the Proteas could learn about how one individual can swing a game in a one-day game. And in a knockout setting, that means you're out the World Cup, of course. His century sets up a total of 265. Proteas like 20 runs short. It was such a little denouement. I mean, there we were. We were like dominating. And then it just takes one knockout game taken away. And it's not like we were knocked out by Sri Lanka, who went on to win the tournament with revolutionary cricket. It's not like we got knocked out by Australia, who seemed to win every other World Cup. Got knocked out by the West Indies. And specifically, it seemed like we got knocked out by one dude. Like, it was disappointing. At the time, people looked back at the selection, tried to blame that. People looked at picking Alan Donald, dropping Alan Donald for Paul Adams at the time, dropping the fast bowler for the wrist spinner. I think you never know what would have happened, to be honest. But for me, I think the focus should be on why Craig Matthews played ahead of Alan Donald. It's read that into it as you will, but like how Paul Adams gets blamed for being picked when he bowled pretty well on the day as well is, I think there's an underlying factor there in how we looked at sides. But anyway, there was the first instance, the next instance of like a selection um, stuff up at the beginning, and what had have been would be in 2015. So the first instance of that happened in 1996. But there was another thing Lara did in the build up to that game, and he talked about his disappointment in how the South African side was basically an all white team. For a team and a nation that supposedly reconciled itself with the racial majority of the country, they were still sending out an all white team. And he pointed out how he was disappointed at that. Number one, he had a point, a very good point. Number two, that really pissed the Proteas teams off that he said that. And I think looking back, you should think about how much you should like the Proteas team. The fact that they were pissed off by that accusation, that was more than valid, I think is a statement in itself that we just weren't ready to be great international ambassadors, to be honest. But anyway, how give it on the traumometer rating? 4 out of 10. It's pretty disappointing at the time, but at the end of the day, the actual exit just kind of looked like one of those things. Things happen in one-day cricket. Someone has in their day. Very, very disappointing, but it's going to rank low. As for 1999, it's when it's about to go off the charts right now. 99. Let's do this one. So it's been 24 years. It still feels too early to speak about it. It still feels too early to speak about that run out. I mean, really, you got to. But that means, if it still feels like it's too early, it's always going to feel like it's too early. So at some point, you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to deal with this seriously heavy, closed bag of psychological issues that we've just, been issued to carry as carry-on luggage as our finite lives drift away. Whew. Okay, I need a moment. 99. Let's do this. This would be the first World Cup where fans would use the C word. They'd also use the word choke, which is probably what we should delve into now. But let's start before the semi-finals. It was such a good ODI team that was playing, that we sent there. We're playing in English conditions, which the bowler could make work for us. But guys like Donald and Pollock bowled very well. What seems to have washed away from people's memory is just how bad our top order batting was. Like, for instance, the late Hunter Cronje was averaging just 12 for that tournament. 12 runs, top order batsman. As a captain, it wasn't good. There's a reason Lance Klusener was named man of the tournament batting at number 8, because he was bailing out the top order all the time. But what a batsman Lance Klusener was in that tournament. He'd walk out there with team in all sorts of trouble, always 6 wickets down in trouble, in a way that you'd imagine John McLean batting, die-hard style. It's just, if he didn't see a gap in the field, he would just chew his gum and hit it over the top. Probably lit cigarettes after he won each game for the Proteas. Looked emotionless, ice cool, incredible player. Anyway, we top the initial group and go into the Super Sixes, which is an inaugural weird thing. We at the time where you carry in your results. Anyway, in the Super Sixes, beat Pakistan in a really dramatic run chase. Beat New Zealand, which ended up being the last time we ever beat New Zealand in a World Cup. Amazing. We've played them in every World Cup, and actually we've lost 5 games out of 5 against New Zealand since that day. Anyway, now we come up against Australia before the semi-finals. We're through to the semi-finals, but it's an opportunity to knock them out. Now, to look through this game, Herschel Gibbs scores 100, takes us to 271, ends up being quite the villain later. Australia batting, they're on 152 after 31 overs, I think it is. Steve Waugh's on 56. He hits it to Herschel Gibbs, who tries to celebrate immediately and drops it. And it was a drop, has to be seen as a drop. The law states that the catch can only be completed when the fielder has complete control over the ball and his movement. And it's very hard of you, Herschel Gibbs, to argue that you were in control of your movement when you try to instantaneously celebrate and you fumble the ball. So Steve Waugh was rightfully given not out. He goes on to make 120, wins the game, keeps them in the tournament. And that's such a interesting piece of subjunctive history that's offered there. Imagine if Herschel Gibbs takes that catch, Steve Waugh is out for 56, Australia don't win that game. That means we don't play Australia in the semi-final. They knocked out the World Cup. We would have topped the Super 6 table. We would have played Zimbabwe in the semi-final had we played them. Granted, they'd beaten us early while, but a semi-final against Zimbabwe, that's such a different setting for a World Cup semi-final. That's so different from the car crash that ended up at Edgbaston. Interesting thing about Steve Waugh. Now, he was credited as saying that Herschel Gibbs dropped the World Cup the instant that he dropped it, which is a good line, a great line. but not one he said, apparently. What Steve should be credited for is actually the Chokers label, what's been haunting us for ages. He's the one that actually credited it. The genesis of the Chokers label wasn't the 1999 World Cup, as a whole bunch of people think. It was actually the year before. We played a one-day series against Australia, like a tournament that ended in a best-of-3 series final. And Steve Waugh was the captain of Australia, new one-day captain of Australia at the time. He was playing some mind games in the press, and in a press conference, he called the team chokers, this word we haven't heard before for the Proteas, chokers, accusing them of always losing when the stakes got high. And in that series, it worked. The Proteas were 1-0 up, but we lost the last two. Australia came from behind to win. And who would have thought that that moment of mental disintegration, as the Aussies would call it, would end up creating a label that the Proteas would have to deal with for the next 25 years and probably beyond, and would be so damning. But hey, onto the semi-final itself. Let's go head first into this. All these recollected images of this Dantean nightmare right now. So we bowl first, get them off for 213. So it's a good feat, It's certainly worth a pat on the bum in the World Bum. Bowlers did their job that day. Now we bat. It's clicking along okay. Then Shane Warne comes on, and I'll tell you, if it wasn't for the way this game ended, Shane Warne should have got far more credit for that bowling spell. It was one of the best instances of showing why Shane Warne was so good. To bowl that attacking lead spin, it was so controlled, it's so hard to do. That was the masterclass there. Undoubted man of the match for me. Anyway, game's got ebbs and flows. It's an odd job catch. This is not so good shot. But let's get to the juice of it. Gets to the final over. Need 9 runs off the final over. 1 wicket in hand. Lance Klusener on strike. Whew. First one, smacks for 4. 5 or 4 needed. Second one, he smacks harder than any cricket ball's ever been smacked ever. 4 runs needed off 1 boy. Now, the actual 4 runs needed, 1 run needed now, 4 balls left. The actual joy feeling was probably the biggest highlight we've ever felt as a cricket fan. That moment of joy of needing 1 run or 4 balls. Then the next ball, Alan Donald nearly runs himself out. There was nearly a run out where he couldn't go through. And the whole country's just thinking, what is he doing? It was so lucky the Australia met the stumps. Camera goes to Alan Donald. You see him kind of be a bit relieved, and it gives a kind of goofy laugh, as if like, could you imagine what a stuff up it would be if I got run out right now? Yeah, geez, about that, just got to wait 1 ball to figure out what a stuff up it was. Anyway, so this ball, right? Damien Fleming bowls a ball, which I vaguely remember seeing a camera angle that made it look like he overstepped the mark and it should actually have been a no ball. Just in case you want to add an extra layer of this painful onion that'll definitely make you cry. Should have won just for it was a no ball alone. Anyway, bowls this ball. Great swinging Yorker. Klusener digs it out. Just goes past the stumps. And he takes a run that was never, ever on. Klusener sets off for a run that wasn't on. I don't think Alan Donald hears the call. I will always sympathise with Alan Donald for keeping his bat in the crease at the non-striker's end the way he did, because, hey, Lance Klusener was so nearly run out himself in that instance. And then it turns slow-mo. Ball rolls to Gilchrist, takes off the stumps, and game over. That's it. We're done. It's a tie, and we're out. Like if only Klusener and Donald could have had a little chat after that third ball, that near run out, a little choke diffusing device. But hey, to be honest, the lesson is probably, look, we were 9 wickets down at the time, and that's what happens when you rely on 10th wicket partnerships and number 11 batsmen to run between the wickets for crucial runs, I suppose. It's obviously just magnified by the nature of it and the calamity. And like if only there was a super over back in those days, what would happen then? What would have happened if there were boundary countbacks in that day, like they used in the 2019 final? Did you know that Australia and South Africa both had the exact same boundary count in that semi-final? The exact same. 17 fours, 3 sixes over both innings. So you couldn't even separate them that. It was the most tiesy tie in the history of ties, was that game. But still knocked us out. So Australia going to thrash Pakistan. No South African watched a ball of that, surely. And Australia started the most dominant series ever, and then South Africa really started having to deal with the chokers label from that World Cup. Now, in a way, as a fan, I think it's comforting to know it'll never get as bad as that. In any sport, no matter what future sporting calamity you'll ever experience in your life, you know it will not be as soul-destroying as that run out. It is the nadir. It is as low as it goes. Nothing will get beneath that. I think there's got to be some kind of emotional liberation in that. You've already experienced the worst. Now, for the actual score on the traumometer level, it's obvious, isn't it? 10, 10, 10 out of 10. Obvious 10 out of 10. It's the benchmark of what any traumometer should set its maximum at, was that moment of that run out in 1999. And let's move on to the one, 2003, the home World Cup for the Proteas, 2003. Now, for me, it's important to contextualize this as we start off, just to highlight how crap the actual results were for the Proteas in that tournament. They lost the opening game to the West Indies at home. Brian Lara producing a Brian Lara tribute act, almost, in Cape Town, one for the ages. Then they lost to New Zealand, despite scoring 300, still lost the game against New Zealand. All these games are at home, by the way. And then, as of course, in the end, couldn't beat Sri Lanka. All of this was in the initial group stage. This was just to get into the Super Six and was losing all these games. All things considered, I say there's a really good argument that says that the Proteas' exit from their home World Cup was worse than Bafana Bafana's exit in their home World Cup in 2010. Way up those results there, and the Proteas come up shorter than Bafana, in my opinion. And don't let the bizarre nature of how we got knocked out throw you. You have to remember that the Proteas were never going to win that tournament. They were never going to smell victory in that tournament. No chance. The fact it was so touch and go that we needed a must-win game against Sri Lanka just to make the Super Sixes should make it clear that they were never going to win the World Cup. But hey, as for actual drama of the knockout blow, even though it wasn't even a knockout game, well, this was just a masochistic treasure for the World Cup. Now, this was going to be another occasion of the Proteas being on the wrong side of rain regulations. And this was also our first encounter with two famous gents that we have a very dark relationship with in the future. And the gents were Frank Duckworth and Tony Lewis. Now, to give you a little impact on how that happened for those of us who remember it. Since 1992, and that injustice of the rain there was other different methods tried to calculate rain things. There was a Dorigo method, a South African, who came up with a curve that was a more fairer system to judge rain-affected games. That turned into the Clark curve, which is basically the same formula that just had more data there. Then came Duckworth-Lewis. And that is the moment, if I understand correctly, that shortening rain targets changed from being elementary algebra to calculus. And that is also the moment where most people, no matter how mathematically inclined you are, realize that life's too short to delve any deeper than that. Basically now, what happened from that point on is that you just had to accept whatever rain target was spewed out at you. You know, there was no way to double check. Who's double checking Duckworth-Lewis? No one's going to do that. No one's going to apply a calculus formula here while there's a rain break going on. We just had to accept the number being credited out. So there always just was this complete mystery what would throw out at that point, just before the 2003 World Cup, which of course got highlighted during this game against Sri Lanka itself. Back to the actual cricket. Now it's like a crunch game against Sri Lanka. But we got to win, obviously. Bowl first, and we are really, really ordinary in the field as Sri Lanka score 268. That's a big total under the lights in Durban, even in today's day and age, even with the inflation of modern run rates. But anyway, now we're like 223 for 6, 5 overs left. Durban rain comes. And this is before people thought of putting the Duckworth-Lewis score on the scoreboard now. Now you see little DL par scores on the scoreboard these days because of this game. They now do this. At those points, we didn't have that. The guys were relying on a printout, a damn like A4 sheet of paper that was showing like a spreadsheet showing that balls left, wickets that have fallen, and targets there, you know, and we were communicating that ball by ball to the players. And somewhere amidst the custodians of that sheet, they'd missed the little detail that the numbers, the fine print, that the numbers on this sheet were to tie the game, not to win the game. So now the wrong target gets communicated. The tied target gets communicated. Mark Boucher even hits a 6. He thought he won the game with it. And then the next ball he blocked, he thought he just had to not lose his wicket. Ended up he still needed one more run because the scores, of course, were tied. And then that was the last ball faced. That's it. And it ends in a tie. Rainfalls ends in a tie, out on a tie again. Now, ultimately, you could scapegoat a few people on this one. You could scapegoat the person that communicated, which is supposedly Nicky Bouyer. You could scapegoat Sean Pollock, how unprepared we were in general. But to be honest, going back to the previous point, it's just worth bearing in mind that this team was never going to win the World Cup. But it must be acknowledged that it had a very important element for such a weird knockout to the psyche of South Africa. Now this showed that we are just cursed in the World Cup. It was no longer this horrible run out in 99. Now we had this completely bizarre rain anomaly to knock us out. So, World Cup's over, knocked out. How's the read on the traumometer eating? Only a 6 out of 10. It certainly scarred later in pain. It adds to the tapestry of World Cup pain in the future. But I think as a fan, because you had to recognize that the Proteas were never going to win in the first place, there's worse to come. There's worse just around the corner to come, to be honest. Let's go to 2007. 2007 in the West Indies. Woo. This first World Cup defined by a team mantra for me. Under Mickey Arthur and Graham Smith, the Proteas were playing brave cricket. First time we've kind of used a label like that, brave cricket. After, in the last few years, these guys had gone on a mission to kind of break out the conservative mindset that South African cricketers had always been accused of, specifically in the one-day format, and aim for higher ceilings. Brave cricket had its finest moment in the famous 4-3-8 game, which was a year before the World Cup. And I think this one needs to be analysed in itself. For me, it's important to note that in that 4-3-8 game where the Proteas famously chased down their target, I don't think it should be credited for revolutionary tactics from the Proteas itself to hit 438. I mean, the Proteas were batting second. They knew they had to bat at 9 and over. You got to go some. The actual brave cricket that day, the brave cricket credit that day should go to Australia and Ricky Ponting. It's Ricky Ponting looking at that wicket those days and telling his Australian guys, the target isn't 350. It's 450. Without that moment, without Tim, if we're just chasing 350, there's no DVD sales of the game. It's not labeled 438 game. It's not. It's Australia needed to put those runs on the board first. Don't discredit Herschel Gibbs on that one. He was amazing batting that way, and it was some great batting performances to make us chase 438. But for me, that was more an idea of showing the kind of actual potential of players of run rates we can do than actually ever any brave cricket notions, and how that was revolutionizing it. But anyway, we're going off to the World Cup, and most of the senior players, as it turned out, were on the brave cricket bandwagon. A lot of the others, not so sure, as certain things in the years went by showed out. But anyway, they get through the Super Sixes, and we're playing Australia on the semi-finals, who are clear favourites, and they're busy being the most dominant winners the World Cup has ever seen. Now, we're in St. Lucia. Looks like a tricky place to bat. Graham Smith wins the toss and chooses to bat first. That raises a few eyebrows there, but hey, brave cricket, right? And even when the conditions aren't suitable for it, this is the plan, is we're going to go there, bat first, and hit one of the greatest Australian ODI attacks out the park from ball one. Now, at some point, you got to distinguish between brave cricket and stupid cricket. And there's a really interesting comparison here, a modern-day comparison with baseball, what the English are using specifically for their test tactics. Ben Stokes the other day, in a phrase that described the underlying baseball theory, recently said there's no such thing as bad shots. No such thing as bad shots, he's saying as a captain. Well, I think, look back at those highlights, those lowlights of the 2007 World Cup semi-final. Look at some of those wickets when the South Africans ended up being 27 for 5, and you try to tell me with a straight face there's no such thing as any bad fucking shot. Whew. Some of those ones, you get Jacques Callis dancing down the wicket, you get Graham Smith backing away. Oh my word, it was just a car crash of note. And it added a new layer to the choking debate, because we were 27 for 5. The game was done then. The game was over 10 overs in. Now, up to that point, I think people said that you kind of it had to be a choke. The Proteas only choked if it's from a winning position. But they didn't smell the winning position there. But they certainly underperformed under pressure, which is the definition of a choke that all kind of sports psychologists use. So it added that very interesting dynamic, or how to understand Protea's trauma, which is the interesting part of a very sour experience, of course. But anyway, traumometer rating, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. 7, look, it's got to rank high because it's a World Cup semi-final. Stakes are high, World Cup semis, and you feel like it's all close. But to be honest, I mean, the fact that it was over 10 overs into the game, all fans knew you had to hit beers throughout that. And there's a kind of drunken haziness by the time the actual trauma exit took place, which takes the edge off some of the trauma. So I would say a 7 out of 10. Some rank higher. This one ranks higher in the corner. 2011. This World Cup, 2011 exit. The Proteas almost caricatured themselves in 2011, really. There was two different storyline tropes happening there. A batting collapse and a disaster run out. Two for the price of one in this World Cup, as a homage to other Proteas pain. Build up to the quarterfinal was pretty good. We won most of our group games. Imran Tahir was bowling really well. He was like a spinning revelation. Debuted in that tournament. And now we have I mean, we topped a group with India in it, in India. I mean, we were looking like the business by there, Maybe it could have even been the one. At one point, we had 3 spinners playing, all of them taking wickets. Tahir, Buerta, Robbie Peterson, unheard of in South African sides. But now we're playing New Zealand in the quarterfinals, which is going to be a running theme of knockouts here, was us playing the Black Caps. But anyway, we're chasing 221. We're 108 for 2, looking pretty good, hey? Well ahead of the run rate. It's looking good. AB de Villiers and Jacques Callis at the crease. Then Callis gets caught at the boundary. Then JP Duminy plays all-around delivery from Nathan McCullum. His off-spin was completely bad. And then the piece that'll define this World Cup is Faf du Plessis runs out, heartbreakingly, his best mate and also the best batsman in the world, AB de Villiers, by absolute miles. Now, Black Caps all around. All the New Zealand players go around and go at Faf du Plessis. Now, this is a moment where, when you're going through a bit of pain here, like in the throes of a batting collapse, it's going to make you angry. It's going to make you angry. So, for one thing, it was just how incensed everyone was at seeing this. And also, it was a sign of how the chokers tag could now be used on the field, really against the Proteas, as such a visceral part of the game. I mean, here we got guys goading, laughing at Faf du Plessis, bouncing into them, calling them chokers. It's just gotten very real about how the tag can really, really affect the players on the field in World Cups. In that game, we end up losing 8 wickets for 64 runs. It's a hell of a bowling collapse, where some really ordinary New Zealand bowlers took a lot of wickets. And this Proteas exit was so in tune with kind of typecast kind of Proteas drama. And traumometer rating, I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. I think the anger, specifically at Kyle Mills, sledging from the 12th man role, but just exacerbated all the drama and all the pain on that one. Before we hit 2015, which of course ends up being another knockout loss to New Zealand, but this one gets a bit more gravitas as it was in the higher stakes of a semi-final now. Now, leading up to the knockouts here, it was a mixed run-in for this AB de Villiers-led team. He was the captain, of course. It had some 2007 vibes to it. It would be a mixture of high ceilings, some high scores with some pretty ordinary losses. But this team was also defined by mantra. Protea Fire was the campaign around the side and the identity around the side. And it certainly looked a whole lot more meaningful than the brave cricket schlock we were fed beforehand. But anyway, so now we get to the semi-finals here with a real, like, we can beat anyone on their day feeling. We had some class players that could score big time. And we have that feeling. It's a 3 a.m. start, South African time, that we're watching this in South Africa, of course. Proteas bat first. There's selection controversy in the start. Kyle Abbott gets dropped for Vernon Philander in the side, which of course has quota undertones in there. Sets a really, really bad tone there. And our innings, we bat first, is such an ebb and flow between a beautiful one-day game to watch for the neutral. You got Brendan McCullum with such aggressive captaincy. It's a wonderful building innings from Faf du Plessis as captain. And then comes the old chestnut of a theme. South Africa on the wrong side of the rain regulation. Now, to look at this one's a bit nuanced here because as some rain-shortened innings, Duckworth Lewis at that time actually spewed out a target that would have been less than the average we would have got. In that World Cup, I think it was 216 with 12 overs left with AB de Villiers firing. And they gave us an adjusted target with a little bit of batting in between of 298 in 43 overs, which was less than the expected score. It was actually, Duckworth Lewis was actually out of touch. I know this will be a whinge, but Duckworth Lewis was out of touch, and they should have been set a higher target that day if the system was more in touch. But anyway, it was such an excruciating series of events for the next innings there. I mean, the next innings, New Zealand's batting innings, when they were chasing us, it had everything. It had a missed run out between Riley Rousseau and AB de Villiers, of all people. It had a dropped catch where Farhan Behardine and JP Duminy collided to each other. I don't think any team in the world could pull off that dropped catch. Then South Africa in a World Cup setting. And then it ends, Dale Steyn couldn't defend the 13 runs New Zealand need to win. There's a 6 outside, and everyone just collapses. Fans and players just collapse. I think on the traumometer level, I'm giving that 9. I'm putting that second behind 1999, actually, because for the sheer variety of painful incidents in the game, there were just so many. It was just such a kaleidoscope of painful incidents in there. And throw in that we weren't able to sleep and you were sleep deprived. It was really just such an emotional experience, that one, deflating to the max. Going on to 2019, and to be honest, there isn't much reason to delve into 2019. All you need to know, it was an injury-hit team that couldn't deal with managing IPL work duty with preparing for a World Cup squad, and it was a team that got nowhere near the knockout stages. It lost any meaningful group game it had. They only started winning decent oppositions when they were mathematically out the running. Because hey, why not torture the Proteas more, showing that they have the ability, they just can't kind of get it right mentally to get it right. Just it was a stab. But to be honest, on a trauma level, it's 2 out of 10. The team wasn't good enough to choke, is what you got to look into it for 2019. So it's amazing. That's what's come with South African cricket. Like the worst ever side we had, the worst ever World Cup we've ever had in terms of performance isn't the most painful. They weren't actually good enough to get into those heartbreaking areas that we were all so used to. So, which brings us to 2023 and beyond, and what's going to happen. I mean, looking through this, to kind of rate all these on the traumometer, the least painful was that 2019 one. The next on the list would be 1996, which at the time, just actually in retrospect, just seems like a kind of standard way to get knocked out of a World Cup, in fairness. The ones that really kind of rued the roost here, let's look at 3 here. What was it? 2003, that was next up with that 6 out of 10. Then 1992, the fact that you couldn't blame too many people other than outside forces meant it was actually a little easier to digest, only in retrospect, of course. And then we hit in 4th place overall, would have to be the 2007 one, the 27 Brave Cricket, 4th most painful one ever. 3rd, it's got to be the one in 2011, actually. I was more angry in 2011. 2007 was possibly a better cricket side than 2011. But 2011 was just just how it kind of ran over a variety of details of shortcomings in the Proteas game. It felt more detailed than how we got knocked out in 2007, oddly enough. And then the second most painful World Cup would have been that 2015 one. The Protea fire. Just the emotional experience of that would take you through the ringer. But the ultimate, of course, that bit of 1999 pain. So, it's World Cup year this year, 2023. What's in store for us? What is going to happen? I don't know. Looking at this rap sheet of these previous eight World Cups, who knows, man? I mean, it could be, we could exit from a semi-final because someone dropped a catch and then fumbled a run out because the wicketkeeper was misreading a duck with lure sheet. I don't know how we're going to get knocked out in this next World Cup, but the odds are we are. Or we might not. Maybe we just win the whole thing.